Helen had spent 30 years being the kind of wife everyone admired, the calm one, the loyal one, the woman who never made a scene. So when her husband raised a glass at their anniversary dinner, surrounded by family, friends, candlelight, and a perfectly frosted cake, no one expected the night to end in silence. Robert called it a surprise, a gift for their future. But the moment Helen heard what he had done without her knowledge, something inside her cracked wide open. Because after 30 years of sacrifice, she realized the man she had built her life around had never truly asked what she wanted. And before the night was over, before the music stopped and the guests went home, Helen would make a choice that would leave everyone in that room stunned. The only thing no one knew yet was how long she had already been gone in her heart. On the night of their 30th wedding anniversary, Helen Whitmore stood in the dining room with a champagne glass in her hand, and a faint line of dried clay still caught beneath one thumbnail. It was the only unfinished thing about her. Everything else in the house had been arranged down to the smallest detail. The table was set with the cream-colored plates she brought out only for holidays. The candles had been trimmed so the wax would burn evenly. The flowers on the sideboard had been cut that morning and placed in the heavy glass vase Robert liked because it looked expensive. A 3-tiered cake rested in the kitchen under a clear dome, waiting to be carried out at the proper moment. Their daughter, Claire, had adjusted the playlist twice. Their son, Luke, had opened the wine. Robert had spent most of the evening moving through the rooms with the practiced confidence of a man who believed the world made more sense when he was at the center of it. From the outside, it looked like a beautiful life. There were 40 people in the house, maybe a few more, friends from church, neighbors they had known for years. 2 couples Robert had worked with long enough to turn into social obligations. Helen's sister, Nora, who lived an hour away and had cried the minute she walked through the front door because 30 years sounded too large and too tender to say out loud. Robert's mother, Eleanor, sat in a wingback chair near the fireplace with a soft shawl over her shoulders, smiling the small, private smile of a woman who had lived long enough to know that family celebrations and family tensions often wore the same clothes. The room was full of warm light and familiar laughter. And still, Helen felt something sharp and quiet moving beneath the evening, like a crack underneath a layer of ice. She had felt it all week, maybe longer than that, maybe for years. At 8:42, Robert tapped his fork against his glass and called for everyone's attention. The room softened around him at once. Helen turned her head and looked at her husband of 30 years. He was handsome in the way men his age sometimes became handsome again, after years of looking merely tired. His hair had gone silver at the temples in a flattering way. His navy jacket fit him well. He had one hand tucked into his pocket, and the other resting lightly against the back of a chair, as if he had just been interrupted in the middle of being adored. People loved Robert Whitmore easily. He was generous in public, good with names, good with stories, good at remembering what people had told him 6 months earlier and repeating it back in a way that made them feel seen. He was the kind of man who picked up dinner for a grieving neighbor and somehow made the gesture look both gracious and effortless. He was calm in emergencies, capable with paperwork, trusted with money, and rarely at a loss for words. He did not raise his voice often. He did not drink too much. He did not slam doors. He was, as many people had told Helen over the years, a good man. That was part of what made a marriage like theirs so difficult to explain. Robert smiled around the room. "Well," he said, 30 years? There was warm applause, a few whistles, and the kind of laughter people offered when a milestone belonged partly to them too, because they had witnessed enough of it to feel included. Helen smiled because smiling had become, over many years, one of the ways she kept the surface of her life from cracking. Robert went on. I've been thinking this week about what makes a marriage last. Everybody always says communication, or patience, or forgiveness. He glanced toward Helen, and his voice took on that fond, public softness she had once confused with intimacy. And those things matter. Of course they do. But honestly, I think what matters most is finding the right person. And I got lucky. The room sighed in approval. Helen felt Claire, standing beside the doorway, turn and look at her. Robert lifted his glass slightly. Helen has been the steady center of our family from the very beginning. She's the reason this house ever felt like a home. She's the reason our kids had what they needed. She's the reason I could build the life I built. That much, at least, was true. Then he smiled wider. And one of the things I've always loved most about her is that she's never been complicated. She never needed much. She was always happy to let me handle the hard decisions. The room laughed lightly. Not cruelly. Not loudly. Just enough. Helen felt the blood leave her face so quickly that for a second she thought she might actually fall. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She looked at Robert, and in that single moment, she understood something with a clarity that was almost physical. He was proud of what he had just said, proud of her smallness, proud of the years he had mistaken for peace, proud of the version of her he had built his comfort around. He kept talking. So tonight, I wanted to give her something special, something that says thank you for 30 years, something that says our next chapter can finally be about us. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. The room perked up. Claire's smile faded. Luke looked amused, then curious. Helen did not move. Robert held up the envelope like a magician about to reveal the final trick. This morning, he said, I put a deposit down on a beautiful condo in Charleston. Waterfront, walking distance to everything. No stairs, no yard work, no New England winters. And next week, the realtor comes to list this house. There was a beat of silence so brief that anyone less familiar with silence might have missed it. Then came the applause. Surprised, delighted, bewildered applause. Someone said, "Oh my goodness." Someone else said, "Robert." Eleanor lowered her eyes. Claire's mouth actually opened, and Helen looked at her husband while the sound in the room blurred and thinned around her. And all she could think was that he had done it in public on purpose. He had done it where she would be too polite, too stunned, too careful to stop him. He had wrapped a decision about the rest of her life in a ribbon and called it gratitude. Robert turned to her, smiling with expectation. "Surprise," he said gently. "You deserve an easy life now, sweetheart." Helen heard herself ask very quietly, "You did what?" He laughed a little, still playing to the room. "I told you I was working on something big. You put a deposit on a condo? And the house goes on the market next week. We can finally simplify. Start fresh." His hand came toward her elbow, light and familiar and unbearable. She stepped back before she meant to. The room changed then, subtly, not enough for anyone to name it, just enough for the laughter to lose its certainty. Claire moved forward half a step. Luke looked from his father to his mother with the uneasy expression of a man who had walked into the middle of a conversation without knowing it had already started years ago. Robert's smile tightened. Helen. But Helen was no longer hearing him clearly, because it was not just the condo, it was not just the house, it was not just the fact that he had once again made a decision first and called it generosity afterward. It was that he had said the quiet part out loud in front of everyone. She never needed much. She was happy to let me handle the hard decisions, as if her silence had been preference, not adaptation, as if her accommodation had been nature, not survival, as if the shape of her life had not been built, one compromise at a time, around what made him comfortable. Claire crossed the room. "Mom?" Helen looked at her daughter's face and saw concern there, but also something worse. Recognition. And that, more than anything else, almost undid her. Because if Claire had seen it, then it had always been visible. Helen set her untouched champagne on the nearest table. She said, with a calmness that did not belong to how she felt, "I need a minute." Then she turned and walked out of the room while her own anniversary party continued breathing behind her. Upstairs, their bedroom was quiet. The bed had been made that morning with the pale gray quilt Helen washed herself, because Robert always forgot to use the gentle cycle. There was a wrapped gift from Claire on the bench at the foot of the bed. 2 framed photographs sat on the dresser. One of Claire and Luke as children at the beach, all sunburned shoulders and missing teeth. The other from Helen and Robert's 20th anniversary, when they still looked, to outside eyes, like the kind of couple other people wanted to become. Helen stood in the middle of the room and pressed both hands flat against her stomach. For 30 years, she had been the one who steadied herself quickly, the one who calmed down, the one who did not ruin the evening, the one who understood what people meant, even when what they said hurt, the one who told herself that good men could still leave women lonely, and that loneliness was not the same thing as cruelty, and that maybe adulthood was simply the art of carrying disappointments with dignity. But standing there with the noise of the party downstairs and her husband's words still ringing in her ears, she felt something inside herself become very still, not shattered, not dramatic, just still, like a door closing softly. Helen Whitmore had been 28 years old when she married Robert. At the time, decisiveness had looked like safety. She had grown up in a house ruled by unpredictability. Her father had been affectionate when he was present and unreachable when he was not, which was most of the time. He was a traveling salesman who lied easily, apologized beautifully, and treated responsibility like a coat he could put on when company came over. Her mother had spent years smoothing things over, covering unpaid bills with charm, making casseroles out of whatever happened to be left in the refrigerator, telling her daughters that peace inside a home mattered more than being right. By the time Helen met Robert at a mutual friend's engagement party, she was old enough to know what instability cost, and young enough to believe its opposite must be love. Robert arrived on time. Robert listened when she spoke. Robert walked her to her car and called when he said he would. He had clean handwriting and a sensible job in commercial insurance. He wore good shoes. He was not careless with money. He talked about the future in complete sentences. After a childhood made of loose ends, he felt like a full stop. Their early years were not unhappy. That was another truth Helen would later have to learn how to hold. Not every painful marriage begins in pain. Sometimes it begins in relief. Their first apartment had narrow windows and a kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. They bought a second-hand couch, accepted mismatched dishes from relatives, and laughed when the upstairs neighbors argued so loudly that the ceiling seemed to shake. Robert was ambitious, but not yet hardened by the habits of being admired for ambition. He asked Helen where she wanted to hang the curtains. He kissed her shoulder while she read in bed. He brought her grocery store tulips because he knew she loved flowers, but didn't like expensive bouquets that looked arranged by people who had never dirtied their hands. When Claire was born, he cried in the hospital room. When Luke came 3 years later, he painted the nursery himself. Helen remembered those things because they were real. She also remembered the other things, the smaller, slower things, the shape that formed over time. Robert liked to decide. At first it seemed harmless. He chose the route on road trips, the doctor when Claire had ear infections, the bank where they opened their first joint account. He chose the neighborhood where they bought their first house because the school district was strong and the commute made sense. He chose the minivan because it was practical. He chose where to spend Thanksgiving because his mother should not have to drive that far at her age. He chose the summer camp because Luke needed structure and Claire needed to get out of her shell. He chose when to refinance. He chose when they were spending too much. He chose when a problem was worth discussing and when it was better to let it go. Helen did not notice at first how little choosing she was doing. Partly because she was busy, partly because she loved her children, partly because Robert made his choices sound like care, and partly because every time she hesitated, he filled the silence so quickly that her uncertainty looked, even to herself, like consent. Their life moved forward in respectable increments. Robert advanced at work. Helen left her part-time position at the library when childcare became too expensive to justify it. Later, when both children were in school full-time, she talked about going back and finishing the degree she had started years earlier. She said it one night while folding laundry at the dining room table, careful to sound practical, not dreamy. Robert looked up from the bills and said, "Why now?" She had not known how to answer that in a way he would hear. "Because I miss having a part of my life that is mine. Because I don't want the only proof that I was here to be clean towels and packed lunches and birthday cakes. Because I am afraid if I do not begin again soon, I will forget what beginning feels like." Instead, she said, "I just thought maybe it's time." He nodded slowly in the way he had when preparing to be reasonable. "With the kids still needing rides everywhere, and my travel picking up, it just seems like a lot to take on right now. Why create stress if we don't have to?" That had been Robert's talent. He could take a woman's longing and translate it into inconvenience. Helen told herself he was not forbidding her. He was simply reminding her of reality. Reality, over time, became the name they gave to his preferences. Years passed that way. Not in dramatic misery, but in steady reduction. Helen became excellent at anticipating needs. She remembered dentist appointments, teacher gifts, grocery lists, refills, lost permission slips, neighborhood obligations, Robert's clients' wives' names, which side dish Eleanor liked on holidays, which flowers made Claire sneeze, which kind of silence meant Luke was angry, and which meant he was ashamed. She kept 3 calendars and a drawer full of batteries. She learned how to host dinner for 12 on short notice. She knew how to remove candle wax from linen. She knew how to tell when Robert had had a bad day from the way he set down his keys. The world around her called this competence. What it often felt like was disappearance. And yet, because nothing in her life was violent or scandalous or obviously broken, she found no language for her unhappiness that did not make her sound ungrateful. Robert was not unfaithful. Robert was not cruel. Robert did not humiliate her openly. Not then. When he disappointed her, he usually did it by absence rather than attack. A forgotten conversation, a decision made too quickly, a dismissal gentle enough to sound sensible if repeated to someone else. When Claire was 14, Helen spent 6 weeks preparing a portfolio for a local arts council grant. It was a small thing, really, meant for women returning to creative work later in life. Helen had begun taking a community pottery class on Thursday evenings, while the children were older and mostly self-sufficient. She loved the clay immediately, loved the patience of it, the way a shape had to be built by pressure that was steady rather than forceful. She made bowls first, then narrow-necked vases, then a set of lopsided cups Claire declared too beautiful to use. The grant would have funded a year of studio access. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. That morning, Robert called from work and said his mother needed to be driven to an eye appointment because the neighbor who had promised to take her had canceled. Helen reminded him about the interview. There was a pause. Then Robert sighed. "I know, but she can't go alone. And this grant thing, if it's meant to be, they'll understand." Helen had wanted for once to hear him say he would handle it. Instead, she drove Eleanor across town, sat in the waiting room under buzzing fluorescent lights, and called the Arts Council from her car to apologize. Later that night, Robert kissed her temple and said, "Thank you for being the kind of person I can count on." She smiled because she did not yet understand how often appreciation can be used in place of partnership. Over time, those moments piled up. A dinner out with friends where Robert joked that Helen had the gift of being remarkably low maintenance, and everyone laughed because low maintenance sounded like praise. A conversation about taking a trip to Santa Fe because Helen had always wanted to see the desert, which turned into a fishing trip in Maine because Robert found a better deal and the kids will enjoy it more. A holiday season when Helen quietly sold a bracelet her aunt had given her, so Claire could afford an unpaid internship in Boston without feeling guilty about rent, only for Robert to tell people later that he had made the numbers work. A difficult spring when Helen had a miscarriage at 11 weeks, and Robert, shaken and awkward and desperate for normalcy, returned to work 2 days later and sent roses with a note that said, "We'll get through this," as if grief were a task to be managed rather than a room someone had to sit beside her in. She had not forgotten that room. She had simply learned how to walk around it. The children grew. Claire became observant in the way daughters often do when their mothers speak less than they feel. Luke, bright and warm and sometimes carelessly entitled, inherited Robert's confidence without inheriting his discipline, which meant Helen spent years softening the impact of his mistakes before Robert ever noticed them. Eleanor grew older, frailer, more dependent. Robert's career settled into comfortable authority. Their house became the place holidays happened. Their marriage, from the outside, took on the polished look of something established enough not to be questioned. And Helen, somewhere in the middle of all of it, became the woman Robert described at parties. Easy, steady, undemanding. The strange thing was that after long enough, even she began to believe it. Then the children left home, one after the other, and the noise that had once disguised the emptiness inside the marriage began to thin. Claire married young and carefully, choosing a man who looked, from a distance, like responsibility. Luke moved to Chicago for work and called mostly when he needed advice or recipes or money he promised to repay. Helen and Robert stayed in the house alone for the first time in nearly 3 decades, and what should have felt peaceful often felt like standing in a museum after closing time. Without the children between them, the marriage had nowhere to hide. Robert worked later. Helen took more pottery classes. They ate dinner at the kitchen island instead of the table. Some nights the television stayed on long after neither of them was watching it. They were not actively unhappy every day. That would almost have been easier. They were something quieter and harder to describe, adjacent. There were evenings when Helen sat across from Robert and thought that if she stopped speaking entirely, he might not notice for several minutes. The first time she tried to tell him that she was lonely, he did not look up from his laptop. He said, "I'm right here." And because that answer made no room for what she actually meant, she did what she had done for years. She let the moment close. By the time their 30th anniversary approached, the silence between them had developed its own routines. Robert began talking about retirement, as if he had already accepted a position inside it. He was 61 and healthy and restless. He liked motion. He liked plans. He liked the feeling of life moving toward something he could point to. He had spent too many years being competent to imagine himself becoming still. So he did what men like Robert often did when faced with the unsettling fact of age. He turned the next phase of life into a project. He began reading articles about warmer climates. He forwarded Helen real estate listings in Charleston and Savannah and coastal North Carolina, always with subject lines that sounded playful and final. "Look at this one. Can you imagine?" No more snow shoveling. He talked about simplifying, downsizing, starting fresh. He talked about what made sense. Helen listened for several weeks before she began, carefully, to say no. Not no forever, not even no completely, just not yet. She liked her pottery studio. She liked the women she had met there. Women who were divorced and widowed and remarried and never married. Women who spoke frankly while their hands moved through clay. She liked being close enough to visit Nora without planning a whole weekend around it. She liked the maple tree in the backyard, even when it dropped too many leaves. She liked knowing which floorboard creaked outside the guest room and where the afternoon light hit the kitchen in winter. She was, for the first time in years, beginning to build small pieces of a life that felt specific to her. When she told Robert that, he looked genuinely puzzled. "It's pottery, Helen. You can take pottery anywhere." "It isn't just pottery." "What is it then?" She had stood by the sink with her dish towel still in her hands, searching for words large enough to hold what she meant. "It is the first room I have entered in years where nobody needs me to be useful before I am allowed to exist." But she could not say that to a man who had spent 3 decades misunderstanding usefulness as love. So she said, "It matters to me." Robert kissed her forehead the way one kisses a child who has become emotional over something temporary. "I know, and Charleston will be good for us." There it was again. The future already decided. Helen started noticing folders left open on Robert's desk. Email subject lines from realtors, notes about square footage and homeowners associations and carrying costs. Once, while dropping off a document he had forgotten at home, she saw a photograph on his computer screen of a pale condominium kitchen overlooking water. There was a heading at the top that read, "Deposit received." She stood there for a long time, not because she did not understand what she was seeing, but because understanding it seemed to require admitting that 30 years into marriage, she still had not been consulted about her own life. That night, she brought it up. Robert did not deny it. He leaned back in his chair and looked tired already, as if her pain had inconvenienced him before he even heard it fully. "I was waiting for the right time to tell you." "You put a deposit down?" "It's refundable for a few weeks." "That isn't the point." "It's absolutely the point," he said. "That's why it's refundable." "No. The point is that you made a major decision without me." "For us," he corrected. Helen felt something hard move inside her chest. "For us," she repeated. "You mean for me, too." He rubbed his forehead. "Helen, we have gone in circles about this for months. At some point, Somebody has to make a decision. The word somebody stayed with her. Not we, not us. Somebody. As if adulthood in their marriage had always belonged to him, and only now, because she was resisting, had the arrangement suddenly become visible. She slept badly that night. In the morning, Robert left early and texted her around 10. "I hate when we fight. Let's not let this ruin a nice week." Their anniversary was 4 days away. Claire came over on Tuesday afternoon to help with flower arrangements and found her mother standing in the kitchen, staring at nothing. Claire had her father's directness and Helen's ability to hear what people avoided saying. At 31, she was freshly separated, though she had not yet started using the word divorce. Her husband, Ethan, had not lied or cheated. He had simply moved through their marriage with a quiet assumption that Claire would do the bending. When she finally stopped, both of them had looked shocked. She carried in grocery bags and set them on the counter. "You okay?" Helen turned too quickly. "Of course." Claire gave her a long look. "Dad said something happened." Helen laughed once, softly. "Your father says something happened the way people say weather happened." Claire waited. After a moment, Helen said, "He put a deposit on a condo in Charleston." Claire straightened. "What?" "And he plans to list the house." "What do you mean he plans to?" "He means to. Apparently that's enough." For a second, Claire looked not angry but embarrassed, and Helen understood at once that this was not the first she was hearing of Charleston. Claire reached for a lemon from one of the grocery bags and set it back down. "Mom," she said carefully, "he mentioned a few listings a couple months ago, but I thought you knew. I thought you had talked about it." Helen nodded once. Of course she had. Of course other people heard pieces of her life before she did. Claire came around the counter then, closer now. "You don't want to go." It was not a question. Helen looked at her daughter and felt the old instinct rise up, the one that protected everyone else from the full truth. "It's not that simple. He means well. I'm probably overreacting." Instead, to her own surprise, she said, "I don't know when I stopped mattering in decisions about my own life." Claire's face changed. Something in her softened and broke at the same time. "Oh, Mom." Helen looked down at the hydrangeas spread across the counter, at the open florist paper, the ribbon, the scissors. Her own hands looked older than she expected them to. Claire spoke very quietly. "You know what's awful? I used to think you just didn't care about that stuff. Big decisions. I thought you liked letting Dad handle everything." She swallowed. "I built half my marriage around that idea. That maybe being easy was what made things work." The room went still. It was one thing to feel the cost of your own compromises. It was another to see them inherited. Helen sat down at the kitchen table because suddenly standing felt too difficult. Claire took the chair beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Helen said, "I don't think I was ever easy." Claire gave a sad little smile. "No, I don't think you were." On Thursday, Helen went to the pottery studio and stayed longer than usual. The room smelled of wet earth and kiln heat and coffee gone cold in paper cups. Music played softly from someone's speaker in the corner. A woman named Patrice, who had recently turned 65 and spoken openly about her divorce with the kind of humor that came only after surviving it, looked over from her wheel and said, "You have the face of a woman who either needs wine or a hammer." Helen laughed despite herself. "Maybe both." Patrice wiped her hands on her apron. "That bad?" Helen almost said no. Instead, she heard herself say, My husband planned our future without asking me. Patrice nodded as if Helen had just described the weather. They usually call that generosity when they want to avoid calling it control. Helen was startled into silence. Patrice shrugged. Sorry. Too blunt? No, Helen said slowly. Maybe not blunt enough. She spent the next hour shaping a wide ceramic bowl and pressing her thumbs too deeply into the clay. She ruined the first one. The second held. That evening, Robert came home in an expansive mood, as though the week's tension had worn thin enough to be stepped over. He stood in the kitchen doorway while Helen chopped onions for the dinner Eleanor would insist was too much trouble. I was thinking, he said, at the party Saturday. Maybe I'll tell people about Charleston. Make it part of the anniversary surprise. Helen turned around so quickly the knife stayed suspended in her hand. Don't. He looked taken aback. Why not? Because it isn't settled. It will be. That is exactly what I mean. Robert gave her the patient expression that had, over many years, become one of the faces she disliked most. Helen, you're making this bigger than it is. It is bigger than you are allowing it to be. We are not 85. We don't need this much house. We don't need the maintenance, the snow, the taxes. I'm trying to do something smart for us. Then do it with me, not to me. The sentence landed between them and stayed there. For a moment, Robert looked almost wounded. Then quietly he said, I think after 30 years I've earned the benefit of the doubt. Helen stared at him. There it was again, hidden inside the language of injury, the belief that his intentions should excuse her erasure. She set down the knife. And I think after 30 years, she said, I should not still have to ask to be included. Robert said nothing, but when the anniversary party began 2 days later, Helen already knew he had not heard her. Or worse, he had heard her and decided to proceed anyway. Back downstairs, after leaving the dining room, Helen sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the muffled drift of voices below. There was a knock at the door. Claire entered without waiting. Mom? Helen looked up. Claire closed the door behind her. Do you want me to ask everyone to leave? The tenderness in that offer nearly undid her more than the humiliation had. No, Helen said. Not yet. Claire came closer. He had no right. Helen let out a breath that shook at the edges. No. He didn't. Did you know he was going to say it tonight? No. Claire sat beside her. Mom. That one word carried so much of what could not be solved quickly that Helen had to press her lips together before answering. I have spent 30 years, she said carefully, making sure nobody was uncomfortable. I don't think I can do that tonight. Claire took her hand. What do you want to do? Helen looked around the room she had kept in order for decades. The folded quilt, the polished dresser, the framed photographs, the closed closet doors behind which every season of her life had been arranged, boxed, labeled, stored. What do you want to do? The question felt unfamiliar, not because no one had ever asked it, but because so few people had waited long enough to hear the answer. I want to breathe, Helen said. Claire nodded. Okay. They stayed like that for another minute. Then Claire squeezed her hand, stood, and said, Whatever you decide, I'm with you. After she left, Helen went to the closet. She did not move with urgency. That was the strange thing. When a woman leaves after 30 years, people imagine fury. A slammed drawer, a shaking suitcase, tears, a dramatic final look around the room. But Helen was past fury, past performance. She took out the navy overnight bag she used when Eleanor was in the hospital 2 winters earlier. She folded 2 sweaters, underclothes, a pair of jeans, her medication, her toothbrush, the small bottle of night cream Nora had given her for Christmas. From the jewelry box, she took only the simple gold earrings she wore most days and the ring her Aunt June had left her when she died. Then she paused. On the top shelf of the closet sat a rectangular linen box Helen had not opened in years. Inside it were the smaller artifacts of a self she had once intended to become. An old sketchbook, photographs from a trip to Montreal before children, a stack of letters, the brochure from the degree program she never finished, a yellowed newspaper clipping with a photograph of her hands holding one of her first ceramic pieces from a community show. At the very bottom was a note in Aunt June's handwriting, tucked inside a card that had accompanied the small inheritance Helen received after the funeral. For when you are ready to choose something just because it is yours. Helen sat back on her heels. She had placed the money from June into their general savings account years earlier because that was what practical people did. Because she trusted marriage then. Because she thought there would be time later to carve something out for herself. Robert had probably forgotten where that money had come from. Or perhaps he had never really registered it at all. In a life where most resources were family resources, a woman's private possibility could disappear that easily. Helen slipped the card into her bag. Downstairs, someone laughed too loudly. Then came the sound of a fork against glass again. Robert, trying to gather the room back into order. Helen closed the bag. She stood, looked once at the bed, and turned off the bedside lamp, though she had not turned it on. By the time she came downstairs, the guests had rearranged themselves into a polite imitation of celebration. No one mentioned Charleston directly. People took their cues from tone, from posture, from where they were told to look. The cake had been brought out. Claire stood beside it, brittle with control. Luke hovered near the doorway, confused and increasingly irritated in the way men sometimes become when emotional reality refuses to behave neatly. Eleanor sat with both hands folded over her cane, looking at no one. Robert saw Helen first. His expression brightened with relief so immediate it made her stomach turn. "There she is," his face said. "Back in position." He moved toward her. "You okay?" Helen looked at him. "No," she said. The room did not freeze exactly. It just became aware of itself. Robert's smile held for 1 second too long, then fell away. "Can we not do this here?" Helen almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because where exactly had here begun? In the dining room where he announced the sale of her future. In the marriage where her silence had always been most convenient when witnesses were present. Claire stepped closer to the cake. Luke looked at the floor. Nora set down her plate. Helen did not raise her voice. That had never been her style, but something in it changed. "You made a life decision for both of us without asking me," she said. "Then you announced it in front of 40 people so I would have to absorb it gracefully." Robert lowered his tone, trying to regain the shape of privacy while standing in the middle of a room full of guests. "That is not what happened. That is exactly what happened." "Helen, enough." There it was, the command she had obeyed in 100 smaller forms for 30 years. Enough. Enough feeling. Enough resistance. Enough inconvenience. Enough truth. And for the first time in her marriage, she did not comply. "No," she said. "You have called me easy for so long that you stopped noticing I was disappearing." Robert stared at her as though he had never heard her speak a full sentence before. "This is insane." "No," Helen said again, more quietly now. What's insane is that you still think I'm the one making a scene. A few people began reaching for coats, for purses, for the social instincts that let a room pretend it has somewhere else to be. Claire moved to Nora. Eleanor closed her eyes. Robert's face had changed completely now. Gone was the charming host, the affectionate husband. In his place stood a bewildered, angry man who had mistaken emotional order for love and could not understand why gratitude was not the correct response. He said, with a tightness that would have frightened the younger version of Helen into retreat, "We will talk about this later." Helen picked up her bag from the foot of the stairs. His eyes dropped to it. Something like disbelief crossed his face. Helen. She met his gaze and felt, at last, no need to soothe what she saw there. "I'm leaving for tonight." "For tonight?" He laughed once, harsh and stunned. "What does that even mean?" "It means I am not staying in this house tonight." "You're overreacting." The old sentence. The old trap. Define her pain as disproportionate, and he never had to measure the wound. Helen looked at him for a long time. Then she said the truest thing she had said in years. "No, Robert. I think I am finally reacting the correct amount." She turned toward the front door. Claire started after her, but Helen shook her head once. Not because she did not want comfort, because there was something she needed to do herself. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. The driveway glistened from an earlier rain. Porch lights from neighboring houses cast yellow pools across the street. Behind her, through the windows, she could see the blurred movement of guests not yet gone and a dining room still lit for a celebration that had ended without warning. Helen put her bag in the trunk. When she got into the driver's seat, her hands trembled so badly she had to wait before turning the key. Not because she doubted herself, because sometimes the body takes a little longer than the mind to believe that a boundary has finally been crossed. She drove to Marianne Brooks's house on the other side of town. Marianne had been Helen's friend since college, though adulthood had thinned their closeness into periodic lunches and holiday cards. 2 years earlier, after 40 years of marriage, Marianne had left her husband and rented a small apartment over a florist shop. The divorce had not been scandalous. It had merely been sad and overdue. Helen remembered, with some shame now, how many times she had listened to Marianne explain loneliness and thought privately, "At least my situation isn't that bad." At 11:15 that night, Marianne opened the door in wool socks and a bathrobe, took one look at Helen's face, and stepped aside without asking a single question. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender detergent. Marianne brought tea Helen did not drink, and an extra blanket Helen did not need. She sat at the foot of the bed, while Helen stared at the wall. Finally, Marianne said, "Did he hit you?" Helen turned, surprised. "No." "Did he cheat?" "No." "Did he decide your life in front of an audience and expect you to smile?" Helen closed her eyes. Marianne nodded slowly, as if that answer satisfied a category she knew well. "Then you're exactly where you need to be tonight." Helen slept very little. When morning came, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling and felt the old reflex rise instantly. Go home, clean it up, explain, make it manageable. Instead, she reached for her phone. There were 9 texts from Robert. The first 4 were practical. "Where are you? Please come home so we can talk." People were worried. This is not how adults handle conflict. The next 2 were hurt. "I cannot believe you did this tonight of all nights. You embarrassed me in front of everyone." The last 3 were angrier. "Luke thinks you've lost perspective." "I was trying to do something good for us. Call me." Helen set the phone face down on the nightstand. A few minutes later, Claire texted, "I'm coming over with coffee, don't argue." Luke called around noon. Helen answered on the fourth ring. His voice was strained. "Mom." "Hi." There was silence. Then, "What is going on?" Helen sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the guest room window at Marianne's small backyard, still silver with early frost. "Your father made a major decision without me and announced it publicly. I left because I couldn't stay after that." Luke exhaled sharply. "I get that it was a lot, but Dad was trying to surprise you. It was clumsy, sure, but leaving in the middle of your anniversary party? It just feels extreme." There it was again. The lesson children absorb when one parent smooths the ground and the other walks on it. Helen did not get angry. She said, "Luke, your father has been deciding things for a very long time. Last night was not the whole story. That's not really fair. He's always taken care of all of us." Helen looked down at her hands. "Yes," she said, "and I have too." Luke was quiet, not convinced, just quiet. When Claire arrived, she brought coffee, a clean sweater, and the kind of fierce gentleness that made Helen think of the little girl who used to defend injured birds against neighborhood boys twice her size. She set everything down and hugged her mother for a long time. Then she said, "Luke called me. He's doing that thing where he acts calm because if he lets himself understand anything, he'll have to examine his whole childhood." Helen actually smiled. "That sounds like your brother." Claire sat beside her. "What are you going to do?" The question no longer felt impossible. Helen looked at the window again, at the bare branches, at the thin autumn light. "I don't know the whole answer yet," she said. "But I know I'm not going back just because he wants this to shrink into something manageable." By the end of the week, Helen had rented a small, furnished apartment above a stationery store downtown. It was hardly larger than the first apartment she and Robert had shared, but it had tall windows and a narrow balcony and a kitchen just big enough for one person to move around without apology. The floors creaked. The bathroom tile was outdated. The radiator hissed unpredictably. There was no room for the large dining table that had anchored so many Whitmore holidays. No guest room, no yard, no fireplace. No space for anyone else's assumptions. It felt to Helen almost painfully honest. Nora helped her buy plates. Claire helped her choose curtains. Marianne gave her a kettle and laughed when Helen cried over it. Robert did not come by in person at first. He called, he texted, he sent an email titled "Practical Matters" regarding utilities, insurance, and the realtor appointment he insisted he was postponing until she came to her senses. Helen read the phrase twice and then closed the laptop. When they finally met in person, it was at a quiet coffee shop halfway between the house and the apartment. Robert arrived early, already seated, his coat folded over the chair beside him. He looked tired in a new way, as though anger and confusion had not been enough to protect him from the beginning of loss. Helen sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Robert said, "This has gone far enough." Helen almost smiled at the familiarity of the sentence. "It has gone 30 years, she said. "I'd say that's far enough." He leaned forward. "I made a mistake with the party. I understand that now. But this, moving out, renting an apartment, dragging the kids into it. I did not drag the kids into anything. They were already inside it. They just had to see it clearly." Robert looked away, jaw tight. "I was trying to build a future for us." "No," Helen said softly. You were building a future you assumed I would fit inside. That's not fair. Why? Because you meant well? He stared at her. I have provided for this family for 30 years. Helen nodded. Yes, you have. And every time I asked for room to become more than useful, you turned it into bad timing. That is not true. It is. He shook his head. You never said any of this. Helen let the silence after that sentence do its work. Then she answered. I did. Just not in ways you respected. I said it when I wanted to finish school. I said it when I asked for time that wasn't for your mother or the children or your work dinners. I said it when I told you I was lonely. I said it every time I asked to be part of a decision before it became a plan. Robert's face faltered then, not into agreement, but into something more unsettling, confusion, as if he genuinely had no memory of those moments as expressions of need. As if a woman's pain only counted, in his mind, when it became loud enough to inconvenience him. He sat back slowly. I thought, he said after a long pause, I thought I was helping by taking things off your plate. Helen looked at him, and for the first time in days, saw not only the man who had hurt her, but the structure that had produced him. A boy raised by a father who made every decision and called it leadership. A son who watched his mother adapt until adaptation became the language of marriage. A husband praised by the world for competence and never asked what that competence was costing the people closest to him. The understanding did not soften her boundary. It only clarified it. I know you thought that, she said. That's part of the problem. A week later, Eleanor called. She asked if Helen would meet her for lunch. They chose a quiet diner with padded booths and weak coffee, the kind of place older women trusted because it had survived too many decades to bother pretending it was new. Eleanor arrived wearing a camel coat and lipstick slightly too bright for daytime, as if she had dressed carefully to meet a grief she wanted to keep formal. Helen helped her into the booth. For several minutes they talked about harmless things. The weather, Claire, Luke, Eleanor's arthritis. The waitress refilled their coffee twice. Finally, Eleanor set down her spoon. I owe you an apology, she said. Helen looked up. For what? Eleanor folded and unfolded her napkin. For how easy I let things become for myself while they were becoming hard for you. Helen did not answer right away. Eleanor continued. I leaned on you more than I should have. After Robert's father died, after my surgeries, after the driving became difficult. You were always the one who showed up, and I told myself it was because you were so capable. Which was true. She paused. But it was also because you were easier to ask than Robert. Helen felt something shift inside her at the honesty of it. Eleanor looked out the window for a moment before speaking again. Robert's father decided everything. Truly everything. What we bought, where we went, when we spoke, how long we stayed. Not in a cruel way, at least not the kind people point to. He simply believed that being a husband meant knowing best. Her voice thinned. I used to say your Robert wasn't like him. And in some ways he isn't. He is gentler. He listens better. He's kinder in public. But deep down, she gave a tired little shrug. Deep down, he still believes love looks like management. Helen sat very still. Eleanor met her eyes. And I helped teach him that. I praised you for being undemanding. I called you a blessing because your steadiness made my son's life easier. Her face tightened. I am ashamed of that now. The apology was not large enough to repair the years behind it. But it was honest. And honesty, Helen was learning, had a strange power. It did not erase pain. It simply stopped asking pain to pretend it had not happened. I appreciate you saying it, Helen told her. Eleanor nodded. He is angry. I know. He is also frightened. He just does not know the difference. Helen looked down into her coffee. Neither woman said anything for a while. Then Eleanor reached across the table and covered Helen's hand with her own thin, dry fingers. For what it's worth, she said, I think you should stay gone until he learns to see you. Helen swallowed. I don't know if he can. Eleanor's expression turned infinitely sad. No, she said. He may not. The weeks turned into months. Thanksgiving was not held at the Whitmore house for the first time in 26 years. Claire hosted in her apartment with borrowed chairs and store-bought pie. Luke flew in from Chicago and spent the first hour moving too quickly, opening wine, offering to set the table, speaking in bursts that made it clear he did not know how to behave inside a family no longer arranged around his father's gravity. Robert came late and brought a side dish no one had asked for. He looked older, not ruined, not broken, just older in the face. He spoke carefully to Helen, as though sharp movement might frighten something he wanted back into reach. Luke watched them throughout dinner with the dawning discomfort of a son noticing that his mother was, in fact, a person. At one point, Claire left the table to take a call from Ethan about final paperwork, and Luke ended up alone with Helen in the kitchen while the dishwasher hummed. He dried his hands on a towel and said, without looking directly at her, I think I owe you an apology. Helen leaned against the counter. For what? For being an idiot. She laughed softly. That's broad. Luke nodded. I know. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture he had since childhood when shame outran language. When Dad said you were overreacting, I just defaulted to that, because that's how everything always got explained. You were upset, and then later you weren't, and things went back to normal. He looked at her then. I didn't realize normal was just you absorbing everything. Helen felt a sting behind her eyes. Luke went on, quieter now. Claire told me about the pottery grant you missed because of Grandma's appointment. I didn't even know that happened. There are a lot of things I don't think I know. He swallowed. I'm sorry, Mom. Helen stepped forward and touched his cheek the way she had when he was little and feverish and pretending he was fine. You were a child, she said. Then you were young. It is not your job to have understood everything. He shook his head. Maybe not. But I should understand now. That, she thought later, was one of the first real gifts anyone had given her since she left. Not agreement, not rescue, just willingness to see. Winter settled over the town. Helen's apartment slowly filled with evidence of her own taste. A striped rug, stacks of library books, bowls she made herself, glazed in deep blue and soft green. A lamp Claire found at an estate sale, a coat hook by the door, a narrow shelf on the balcony for plants she would probably forget to water in January, but bought anyway because they made the place feel inhabited. She picked up extra shifts at the community arts center helping with children's classes and found that she loved the predictable mess of it. Small hands in paint, aprons tied badly. The sweet concentration children brought to making something imperfect. On Thursdays, she stayed late in the studio, often long after the others had gone, and worked the clay until her shoulders ached in the best possible way. She was not young. She was not beginning from nothing. She was beginning from herself, which was harder and truer. Robert asked her to come to counseling. Helen agreed, though not because she believed therapy could restore what had been lost. She agreed because she wanted, finally, to speak in a room where interruption would be noticed. In their third session, The therapist asked Robert what he thought Helen had needed most from him over the course of the marriage. Robert answered immediately. Security. Helen almost closed her eyes. The therapist looked at her. Was that it? Helen took a breath. No, she said. I had security. What I needed was recognition. I needed partnership. I needed to be asked who I was becoming instead of being thanked for staying the same. Robert's face changed in a way she had rarely seen. Not defensive, not charming, not controlled, just lost. What was I supposed to do differently? He asked, and for the first time it sounded like a real question. Helen looked at him for a long moment. When I told you something mattered to me, she said, you could have believed me before you measured whether it made sense to you. The room was very quiet after that. Later, driving home alone through sleet and traffic lights blurred by winter rain, Helen realized she did not need Robert to answer perfectly. She only needed him to hear the sentence whole. Whether he could live by it was another matter. By March, the house had not been listed. Robert postponed Charleston indefinitely. It might once have felt like proof of change. Now it felt more like aftermath. One afternoon, he came to her apartment carrying a cardboard box. Inside were things he had found while cleaning the hall closet. Her old sketchbook, the yellowed Arts Council application, the note from Aunt June's card she must have dropped years earlier, and a small ceramic bowl she had made in one of her first classes. She had forgotten it existed. Robert stood awkwardly in the narrow entryway while she looked through the box. I didn't know, he said. Helen did not ask which part. He went on anyway. I mean, I knew you liked the classes. I knew you needed things outside the house, but I didn't. He broke off and started again. I don't think I understood how much of yourself you kept setting aside. Helen touched the rim of the bowl with one finger. It was uneven. The glaze pooled too thickly at one edge. She remembered making it while Claire was in college and Luke had just left for Chicago, her hands shaky from how empty the house felt. Robert's voice was quieter now. I thought if I handled enough, you'd be free. I didn't realize I was also deciding the shape of the freedom. The sentence was better than many he had offered before. Maybe even true. But truth arriving late still arrives late. Helen set the bowl back in the box. I believe you mean that now, she said. He nodded, eyes on the floor. Does that matter? She looked at him with tenderness, so exhausted, it barely resembled hope. Yes, she said. It matters. He looked up then, and there was such naked longing in his face that for one dangerous second, Helen understood how women returned. Not because the wound was gone, but because remorse, when it finally appears, can look so much like the love you waited for that your body forgets what it cost to survive without it. Robert took a step closer. Come home. Helen's heart beat once, hard. Then she thought of the dining room, the applause, the way he had used an audience to corner her into gratitude, the hundreds of smaller moments that had led there, the girl she had once been, impressed by steadiness, the woman she had become, mistaken for simple because she had hidden her complexity to keep the peace. The apartment behind her, with its chipped mugs and single chair by the window, and no room at all for anyone else's certainty. She shook her head. I don't think that's home anymore. Robert closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked not angry but devastated. Helen hated that. Hated causing pain. Hated, even now, the part of herself that rushed to comfort the person who had benefited most from her silence. But she had learned something essential in the months since she left. A woman could feel compassion without offering herself as the solution. Robert stood there another moment, then nodded once. "All right," he said. He left the box. He left the apartment. He left, for the first time in their marriage, without taking the conversation with him. The divorce, when it came, was quiet. No scandal, no courtroom theatrics, no betrayal dramatic enough to satisfy people who believed only spectacular suffering justified a woman's departure. There were papers, meetings, financial disclosures, difficult conversations about the house, which was eventually sold, though not to fund Charleston. Robert moved into a smaller place on the other side of town. Helen kept the apartment another year, then rented a modest studio nearby with more light and enough room for a proper pottery wheel. Some friends understood immediately. Others never did. A few said things that sounded sympathetic but carried judgment under the surface. After all this time? But he was such a good man. Wasn't it a little late to start over? Helen learned not to explain. Not every truth fit inside other people's appetite for neatness. Claire finalized her divorce and started again slowly, more carefully this time, with a life she chose on purpose. Luke called more often, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to know how his mother actually was. Eleanor's health declined, and when Helen visited, it was by choice, not obligation. Robert and Helen learned, painfully and imperfectly, how to speak without the old script whenever family events required it. They were kinder to each other once the marriage ended than they had been in its final years. That was one of the sorrows no one warned Helen about. Sometimes peace came only after the structure that should have held it was gone. A year after the anniversary party, Helen stood in her studio on a cool October evening and glazed a set of bowls in deep blue. The radio played softly in the corner. Outside, the streetlights were coming on one by one. Claire was bringing takeout later. Luke was flying in the next morning. Nora had mailed a silly card that said, "Here's to second firsts." Marianne had left flowers at the door with no note, because not everything required explanation. Helen washed her hands at the sink and looked at herself in the window reflection. She was still lonely sometimes, still sad in ways that surprised her. There were mornings she missed the old house so sharply she could have cried over the memory of a drawer handle or the sound of Robert clearing his throat in the next room. There were moments she remembered his early tenderness and wondered what mixture of habit, fear, and bad inheritance had slowly transformed care into control. There were evenings she stood in the grocery store holding 2 tomatoes and felt the ache of having become, at this age, a woman shopping for one. But regret was not the deepest thing she felt. Relief was deeper. Clarity was deeper. And beneath both of them was something steadier than happiness. Self-respect. Claire arrived just after 7 with Thai food and a bottle of wine. She kicked off her shoes by the door and looked around the studio the way she always did, with open admiration. "It smells like clay and freedom in here," she said. Helen laughed. "That sounds slightly dramatic." "Maybe," Claire said, setting the bags down. "Still true." They ate at the work table among brushes, glazed jars, and unfinished pieces. Halfway through dinner, Claire looked up and said, "Are you sad today?" Helen considered the question. The younger version of her would have said no immediately to protect someone else from the burden of hearing the truth. The woman she had become took a moment. "Yes," she said. "A little." Claire nodded. "Me too, but not in a bad way." Helen smiled. "Yes," she said. "That." After Claire left, Helen cleaned up slowly. She turned off the radio, stacked the bowls to dry, and stepped onto the narrow back stoop behind the studio. The air was crisp. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once and was quiet. A train sounded in the distance, low and lonely and ordinary. She thought about the night she left. How people would probably always summarize it by the anniversary party, by the public announcement, by the bag in the trunk and the drive across town. But that was never the whole story. Women rarely leave in a single night. They leave in layers, in every swallowed sentence, every postponed desire, every time they are thanked for shrinking, every time the life built around them leaves no room for the self inside it. And then sometimes, one evening arrives that simply refuses to carry the weight of all the others. The anniversary had not ruined Helen's marriage. It had revealed it. That was different. Important even. Because revelation, however painful, was a form of mercy too. It ended the long confusion. It named the loneliness correctly. It showed her that endurance was not the same thing as peace, and that being needed was not the same thing as being known. Helen stood in the dark a while longer, her arms folded against the cold. Then she went back inside, locked the door, and turned off the last light herself. Sometimes God does not perform miracles by changing everything around us overnight. Sometimes His miracle is the quiet strength He places inside a weary heart, the courage to see the truth, and the grace to take one faithful step forward when life has been painful for far too long. In everyday life, many people carry silent burdens behind closed doors, smiling through routines, family dinners, and ordinary mornings while their hearts are asking heaven for peace. And maybe that is the message of this story, that God sees what others overlook. He hears the prayers we never say out loud, and He can lead us out of heartbreak and into healing in ways we never expected. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need this message. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. May God bless every person watching, protect your home, heal your heart, and fill your life with peace, wisdom, and unexpected miracles.